All right, this one's gonna be a good one. I like you said, it's not terribly long, but it's definitely it's the nuts and bolts to the premise of the whole book, really. I mean, following the footsteps, right? And why we're not trying to create pincushion. So I will
Yeah,
you tell me where you want to start. And
let's start right at the top here. So,
yeah.
yeah, the thing, and Jeffrey, you're right. As
Hey,
I've been
hey, hey,
rereading
Trent,
this,
hey, Trent, just call me Jeff, okay?
Jeff. Okay, I look at your picture. It says Jeffrey on the thing. It's automatic. But as I reread this um, and reading it with more purpose to be able to talk about this and moderate the discussion here, I appreciate that that it stood the test of time. But the one thing I really appreciate is you start out with just some pretty common sense terminology and phrases, and then you back it up with the court cases. And I've noted that in here is I don't have the mind sometimes for the court cases, but I love just the common sense, and that's the way this chapter starts out for me. So just right here, 201, no doctrine of land surveying and of the law is more widely known, espoused and followed by the land surveyor than the doctrine of following in the footsteps of the original surveyor, or is it? And that's how every Survey 101 class starts, right? We talk about following the footsteps, the history of surveying, and exactly what we do. But I love just at the next page here, um, you continue on. It says there are only two possibilities for the pincushion corner given this doctrine of the law. Land surveyors do not believe this, or there is a difference of opinion on the fundamental question of what constitutes an original survey of the property, right? So either we're all lying to each other when we say following in the footsteps, or we don't understand what that means. And so last week or 2 weeks ago when we met, we kind of started getting into this discussion. What is the function of a surveyor? What is following in the footsteps? So I just thought we'd start out the discussion today and let some people kind of start asking questions and or defining what you believe following in the footsteps actually means and what your role as a surveyor is.
Come on, Mr. Bush.
Following the footsteps of a surveyor means to go onto the land and find as many clues as you can to figure out what the original surveyor was intending to do. Find monuments on the ground that the person set or another following surveyor might have set to determine where the best location of the property could be reestablished at.
And I want to follow up with that one because we are working on a map that we're doing in Alta on, and we found all of the original corners. Well, I shouldn't say all, but we found a lot of controlling monuments, but we realized that they miscalculated the breakdown of the section, and it's along a freeway right away, which now are basically in the wrong spot by 6 feet. So to contradict that conversation of following the footsteps, we found all the original corners, but they miscalculated everything. And so, the original corners hold, but do they really? So I wanted to throw that out there.
Well, and I was going to throw kind of to tag on to that is we talk about intent quite often, right? And so I think, TK, to your point, that's almost a different discussion, right? What did they intend to do? Well, they intended to break it down correctly, but they didn't. So I'm a better surveyor. I can break it down. I'm going to reset corners. I'm going to do a pincushion, right? And I think maybe that's a little bit where we get lost is we have a dual discussion. We discuss intent, but we also discuss the
Blunders.
footsteps, and there's this cognitive dissonance between the two
Yeah.
that they're not one and the same. And so their intent was to set a corner. That's what we follow.
Yeah,
Go
but
ahead,
the
Jerry.
intent of who, Trent? The intent of who?
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, in theory, yeah, the intent would be that the monument should have been on the highway right away, but it's 6 feet south. So we're not following the corners or holding the corners. We want to hold the right of way, but Mr. Jerry's hanging out in the park, so he wants to chime in.
We're camping for a third week in a row, and Rachel
love
gave
it.
me permission this time to log in. So,
I love
Rough
it.
life.
um,
Well,
the
he's
intent
retired,
is not
remember?
the intent is not the intent of the surveyor, is the grantor and the grantee. That's what the intent is. So we're not trying to recreate what the surveyor intended to do. We're trying to recreate what the grantor and the grantee intended to do. Now, we always say that wherever the original surveyor placed a monument, right or wrong, that's where it belongs. When you look at it in the terms of the public land survey system, that was the federal government setting corners for land that hadn't gone into private ownership yet. But once it's in the private ownership, the intent is grantor grantee, not the surveyor acting on representative of the federal government, like in the public land survey system. So there's some parallels there, I think, but I think there's some differences in there also.
Great points.
Absolutely.
Well, you were breaking up there a little bit on me, Jerry. I didn't quite catch it, but we don't have to get stuck on this point.
I bet if you turn your video off, Jerry, you'll probably have better service. There you go. I bet you won't eat up so much bandwidth at the picnic.
Yeah, I'm working off a telephone hotspot here out in the wilderness. So
I love it. You're doing amazing.
Okay, so we've got a couple points in here and points of clarification, right? So when we talk about intent, which comes in contact with this discussion often, right? The intent, as Jerry said, is not what was the intent of the surveyor. The surveyor's intent is to follow what the grantor and grantees instructed him to do, right? So an intent is not the surveyor's role, it's the grantor and grantee's role. So I think that's a great point of clarification. And then to TK's point, the intent and David too, the intent of, or the following the footsteps is, they intended to break down the section properly, but they didn't. And so we go find those corners, and the rules of law have, like acquiescence, right? So it was put wrong, but they've relied upon those. And so there's some action on those different parts. And so that's part of that evidence gathering we do. We have to look at so much more than just one piece of this. We look at the section breakdown, we look at the history, we look at adjoiner deeds, we look at other records of survey, we look at, a lot of information, and we gather this and we have to evaluate it as surveyors. And so that's where this, in my opinion, the deviation from following the footsteps, because also we're evaluating, we're coming with our own opinion, and so we have to get back to this, what was their role in conveying what the grantor and grantees wanted to do.
And back to my example, thankfully it's massive commercials, like a couple 100-acre commercial, but it's still raw dirt, and so things can be remapped and refixed. So
Yeah. Well, and that probably gets to too, TK, is what about, in our first week we talked about our ethical obligations as surveyors. So maybe walk us through the example. You found these corners, you found that the section was broken down incorrectly. Are you reaching out to that surveyor trying to, hey, this needs to be fixed? Can I fix it? Can you fix it? What did that look like for you in this one?
yeah, fortunately, and same situation. We did reach out, obviously, as soon as the map doesn't affect our ALTA parcel. It's an abutting parcel map that was created, and they're working on that particular survey firm. This map was done in 2004, and they also did the neighboring parcel in 2005 for another like massive commercial center. And even that parcel to the east is still mapped incorrectly, but it's not 6 feet, it's more like 3 feet. So it's so weird that these maps were recorded within a year or two apart, and they're both actually busted. But they are working on, the conversation is they're working on remapping things, but didn't really find those errors, but they were working on other maps and dedications. And now that we've brought it to light, obviously they're gonna work on hopefully resolving that. But yeah, it's gonna it's a massive commercial center with one of those big box stores. So
Okay.
it'll be
Well, fun.
costly fix, but thankfully I think we caught them at least in the middle of their current mapping as well. So things can get resolved, but it's been that way for 20 years already. So
You know, in many jurisdictions that becomes acquiescence or other stuff. So there's a lot of
Yeah.
things that
Yeah.
you start spider webbing this out, and one thread pulls on another. But kind of coming back to this idea of following in the footsteps, what we have up here at the bottom of the screen now is the original surveyor or following surveyor. And I know that Jeff has had a lot of discussions. In fact, when he was doing his American Radio Hour, you know, I really enjoyed listening to that. And you spent a lot of time talking about this first surveyor concept there, but the original surveyor. And so who is the original surveyor in this? And we talked a little bit about this last time as well, right? The original surveyor is someone that's breaking something down and creating new parcels inside of a section for the first surveys inside of a section, or for the section breakdown itself inside of a township as far as a first government surveyor, right, versus a private one. But I'm just going to read this because I really enjoyed this, but in 2.03 here, the book says there are other functions or roles for the land surveyor, and then this indented portion here. First, a surveyor can, in the first instance, lay out or establish boundary lines within an original division of a tract of land, which has theretofore existed as one unit or parcel. In performing this function, he is known as the original surveyor. And when his survey results in a property description used by the owner to transfer title to property, that survey has a certain special authority in that the monument set by the original surveyor on the ground control over discrepancies within the total parcel description, and more importantly, control over all subsequent surveys attempting to locate the same line. Emphasis on original. And then the second portion, a surveyor can be retained to locate on the ground a boundary line which has theretofore been established. When he does this, he traces the footsteps of the original surveyor. In locating existing boundaries, correctly stated, this is a retracement survey, not a resurvey, and in performing this function, the second and each succeeding surveyor is a following or tracing surveyor, and his sole duty, function, and power is to locate on the ground the boundary corners and boundary line or lines established by the original survey. He cannot establish a new corner or a new line terminal point, nor may he correct errors of the original surveyor. He must only track the footsteps of the original surveyor. The following surveyor, rather than being the creator of the boundary line, is only its discoverer, and is only that when he correctly locates it. So Jeff, do you want to talk us through a little bit here of
Yeah,
where you
this
come
is
from as far as original surveyor and defining this?
yeah, this is where it gets a little complicated. I would do this over again in a second edition. I took this is absolutely correct. Okay, spot on. And I took it out of the court case of Rivers versus Lazio, which is in my mind an infamous case, because right after this, that case goes completely off the rail. Okay. Actually, this case is Rivers versus Lazio is the genesis, in my opinion, of the first surveyor concept. And this was Florida Court of Appeals. The appellate court judge who wrote this, this part is good. Like I said, there's plenty more. There are plenty more court cases that say basically the same thing. That's what I had in my hands at the time I was looking for it. I plugged it in there, and then I thought, well, I'll explain Rivers versus Lazio later, and which I kind of do later in the chapter. Yeah, those are the fundamental. Those are number one, first, original surveyor. Second, retracement surveyor. Couldn't have put it in better words myself.
And I think that was kind of what Jerry was alluding to was, basically you have the GLO surveyors and then you have the next surveyor that comes in, and that's what we're relying upon is that next surveyor. And all we're doing is retracing that surveyor from there on out. So, yeah.
Well, that's what we should be doing. And then we run into all kinds of problems. And we talked about, I listened to a lot of this in the introduction, and then maybe in chapter 1 as well. Then you get into things like, well, you know, I go out and I survey a lot, and it's supposed to have so many square feet. It's got to be 100 feet wide and 150 feet deep. And I don't have 150 feet deep. I don't have 100 feet wide. And now it doesn't meet code. And now that they take it down to the building department. The building department says, you know, you got to have so many square feet. This lot is, you know, doesn't work. Or that this lot, you're going to have to get some kind of variance. This lot isn't, you know, the standard lot. I had actually had somebody call me just 2 weeks ago on similar situation. We had done a survey, and he took it down to the building department, and the building department said, you don't have enough square feet, because we held the monuments that were in place. So that's a whole other story besides what I'm talking about here. If you want to talk about the fundamental principles of surveying, you're either an original surveyor or you are a retracement surveyor. And if your retracement, you find that you have now you have a lot that doesn't have enough square footage, or the setbacks don't work anymore, does that mean the boundary's wrong? And how can the clerk down there at the building department tell you where the boundaries are on a piece of property that you survey? Only if we knuckle in and say, oh yeah, well, now I need to go another source to the pincushion. Well, now, dadgummit, I need to go out there and I need to drive in some pins, so when I leave the field, I have a lot that's 100 feet wide and 150 feet deep, because that's what the guy at the building department told me I'm supposed to have. But you don't have 100. You've got 99.56 by 151. No, let's make it short. 49.25, and that's where the monuments are. That's where it's become established on the ground. That's where the occupation is. You ask anybody in the neighborhood who knows anything about the property, that's where the property is. It's not your fault that it doesn't conform to what the title company says, to what a title attorney says, to what the guy at the building, or the guy or gal at the building department says. That's irrelevant to the basic discussion of what are we supposed to be doing. And unfortunately, and this isn't in chapter 2, unfortunately now, you know what, I told you, TK, I was going to shut up and let other people talk.
You do it.
Where you're going is where I want to take some of this discussion. So you're right on track.
I'm not going to get into the title company and title attorney discussion until somebody forces me. Okay.
I do want to, I guess, piggyback on that a little bit. We're currently working on we just delivered a survey today, but the guy wanted to know, he's buying it. He didn't want an Alta, but he just wanted to verify improvements and set the corners. So it's a deeded lot from, like, say 1955 or something like that. Comes down, starts at the west quarter. So northwest, beginning at the northwest quarter, coming down the center line, bearing in distance, and coming around 262 feet. Well, if you come down the distance, it creates 1,500 foot overlap into the building. Well, that wasn't the intent. And of course, the monument, the west quarter, is not the same monument from 55. So, you know, in that situation, we now have a record and measured distance across that north line that would fit the improvements between the building and the fence line, right? So it's, you know, it's going back to those things of knowing that original monumentation is not the same from 55 as it is today, and having those same conversations with the client. You don't have encroachments. You're shortened up by 1,500s on that north line, right? So, but educating the client, right? Educating the public.
15. I thought you said 1,500 feet. You're talking
No,
about 1,500s.
1,500s.
Okay.
Or maybe 2,500s, but whatever it is, right? Like, it's the improvements from the building lines. It was a zero building face to an existing fence was 262. It just happened to be shifted over 2500 or whatever. So, but same conversation. It's like if you're not following those or taking that stuff into account, right? We would have sent to the client that his building is encroaching in his neighbor by 2500s when that's not really the case. 50, 70 years later. So
I did a survey in downtown Birmingham where, you know, the buildings are all, you know, right against each other. Okay, zero lot lines, the building built right next to each other. And, you know, the original corners on the block are just like totally non-existent anymore, except surveyors have gone out there and they've set crosses on offsets. And one of the major surveying companies here in Birmingham, one of the oldest, they will take those crosses later cut into sidewalks, which sidewalks probably weren't there when these buildings were built, that were cut into sidewalks on offsets for the block, and they will take those crosses in the concrete as the gospel, and then they prorate out the property lines in between. And I'm reading a legal description for the lot that I'm working on that had been rewritten, and it said, you know, begin at the block corner, then go so many feet to you know, to the corner of the lot, then go north 0.02 feet to the face of a building, turn an angle to the right, go 0.05 feet, then turn an angle to the left and go 100 feet through the block, and did the same rigmarole on the other side, no, they didn't call for the lot corner. They were ostensibly setting the lot corner. They rewrote a legal description to go 500ths into a building that had been there for 100 years. Sometimes we have to stop and, you know, just sit back and go, what makes more sense here? Which is most likely to have been in its original position? A building built 100 years ago with another one built right up against it, or some crosses in the sidewalks and, you know, representing offsets at each block corner.
yeah.
Absolutely. The common sense of that is it gets lost, right? Because we can measure. I can measure better now, right? The equipment I have. So we've had some pretty robust discussion here. I just want to take a second, and maybe some of your younger voices is making sure this is kind of understandable what we're getting at of this first surveyor, second surveyor, original surveyor discussion, the retracement there. And we can get into some more examples in the book, but I just want to make sure we're not getting lost in the examples that we have here. You know, Trent's example of just 2500ths off, you know, but the building's there, or Jeff's example, the building's 100 years old. I mean, that's a clear indication of what the intent was there. Any other thoughts or comments from maybe someone that hasn't had a chance to discuss or wants to raise their hand? Troy.
I got something, Trent. Back on Jeff's example, he talked about a lot not being exactly, or being too small. So my question on that is, how was the lot originally laid out? Was it, you know, by tape? And if it was retraced by tape, would it come out to 100 by 150? So, you know, we talk about retracing the steps, but we're doing it with RTK and total stations now, instead of, you know, manual theodolites and tape and level. So it makes me wonder on that aspect, because where I live here, I live very close to a section corner, and the section corner has been determined to have been erroneously placed by the original surveyor, which would have been back in the 1800s. The surveyor hired by the government to go out and set out the townships. And there was one section corner, or I should say the monument for the section corner was placed erroneously, and just happens to be in the very near vicinity of a donation land claim up here in Pendleton. So, and then hundreds, if not, well, let's just say hundreds of homeowners, landowners have been based off of that erroneously placed monument for a section corner, but our county surveyor is not willing to do anything about it because, and I would say according to Jeff's book here, the monument should hold regardless of whether it's was placed poorly or not. But if that's the case, then a lot of property lines might have to be adjusted. So that's kind of the case up here where we have, if we hold that monument, property owners could end up getting screwed over. And it's, I mean, I'm one piece of property away from it. And I imagine it probably exasperates as you go farther away from it. And it's like 50 feet. It's big. It's not a small little foot off or something like that, or half a foot. It's 50 feet. That was determined by one of our most well-known surveyors in town, who's been doing it for 50 plus years, and everybody trusts him. And he says, nope, this is off. And I won't, and even on the survey he did in the area, he says, I will not take no responsibility for this erroneously placed monument, which was the original rock was probably done back in the 1800s. And then I think it was redone again in the early 1900s, where an actual brass cap was installed somewhere in the 40s, I think, or maybe the 50s. But nobody wants anything to do with it, including our county surveyor.
So reliance becomes a big portion of that, right, Troy? That if properties have been relied upon, there's court cases say we don't want to upset that. That becomes a, there's some examples here not too far where I work often, and I've shared this in this meeting before, but there's one corner, it has 3 different locations, and it depends on which year, and the tie sheets and surveys for that say, okay, this is the 1967 to 1972 monument, so deed surveys that were done during that era were written off of that monument, and here's the 1982 monument, there's an original one. The other portion of that is we forget those original stones were, you know, sometimes they're 1 foot by 1 foot, a little bigger, a little smaller, and so when you set a pinpoint in a brass cap to represent where do you hit that stone and tie off of it, starts having some pretty big changes as you go out. The other thought that comes to my mind in your example there is when we were going through evidence and procedures, I think there was 2 different chapters that spent a long portion of the material talking about when you're retracing and reading a deed, you can only use the methods and accuracies that were used to create that deed. So if it was measured in a chain, your tolerances are that, right? It's not the hundreds and thousands tolerances because that deed was written to that. And so, you know, in surveys I've done where you're off that little bit, my common sense analogy on a survey is I'm going to call out all the original dimensions out there, and in my narrative I'll talk about what I did. But if I can get another person out to that corner by rounding to the nearest foot because that's what the original deed was, or that's what the original tolerance is, then I've done my work to retrace that and show that on a record survey, because my whole purpose is to get someone else back to that corner.
Yeah, Pendleton is kind of neat in that when the town of Pendleton was originally laid out, it was called the reservation addition. So we took a chunk out of the local Indian reservation, or the government did, I should say, to create the original northeast to southwest orientation of Pendleton. And to this day, there are pretty much still basalt rock stones at the 4 corners, and I don't know how many feet in between, 500 feet, and they're about 1 foot by 1 foot, and you can still find them today at the surface, and they've got an X right in the middle of them. And you know, it's pretty neat that you can sit there and put your RTK right in the middle of that X and get, you know, pretty darn pretty accurate, within what their measurement was. And that's kind of a neat thing about Pendleton is we still have those. But it'd be interesting, there's a reason we have RTK and total station, because it's not only more accurate, but it is a lot quicker. But that doesn't mean it's necessarily the better way to do it.
Yeah, I threw it out here last time. I asked Jeff, if we went back to chain and those type of measurements, would we see the same pin cushions we do today? But I actually got a call this week from someone that was on the Wisdom Wednesday last time, and he agreed. We spent some time chatting about that. It's like, yeah, if we went back to those old measurements, you better believe we're not going to see pin cushions as much, because we're not going to take responsibility for the precision that chain can get and how tight we can pull it and all that stuff.
Well, we need, I don't know if I have it in the book, but one of the things that we're just now recognizing, what started, I'll give credit to the 2011 ALTA standards. And 2011 ALTA standards, the standards finally recognized the difference between precise measurements and accurate results. And the reason they did that is because of title insurance companies. Look, you already got me talking about title insurance companies again.
Only for a second. Only for a second.
Okay. Anyway, those are important terms. We need, and we'll get to it. Those are very important terms, because a lot of state standards still talk about accuracy in the state standards relative to measurements. Okay. Now, yes, you can have accurate measurements that are correct. Accuracy means correct. You got the correct result. You can have measurements that have a correct results, but that's not how the terminology comes out in the ALTA standards, and that's important because they're writing title insurance off of those ALTA standards and the ALTA surveys that you're turning in. But real quickly, we've got to recognize the difference between precise measurements. You can have precise measurements. The question is, and you've got to have, by your standards, you got to have precise measurements. But the question is, do you have accurate results? And accurate results means correct location on the ground. That's what they're ensuring. The correct location on the ground. Any boundary determination, is a two-part question. What's the property and where is it located? The what question is the title company's question. The where is our question. So the tools really don't bother me. The tools are always going to change. It'll change the precision of our measurements. This is the reason why we have the doctrine of monuments. The monuments are in the ground. They generally don't move unless somebody moves them. And so your correct results are to get the correct monuments, the true and correct monuments that represent the true and correct, the true and accurate boundary. So you can have an accurate boundary and the measurements, maybe not so precise, but there's a difference there.
That's what Jerry threw in the chat. Doesn't matter how accurate you survey the wrong thing, it's still wrong.
It's still wrong.
And then the other to the other point,
you can very precisely measure the wrong piece of property and have totally inaccurate results.
That's exactly it. And then the other one in the chat, which we don't really, because we're so spoiled in the West, but Matthew threw in the chat, for someone who only surveys in the Southeast, this is a whole different ball game, which makes for interesting learning. So, having those diverse audiences and that kind of stuff, which I think maybe where Jeff could come into play more on that, talking about Eastern surveys and colonial state type surveys, meets and bounds stuff, as opposed to us.
You got me going. I just wanted to say one thing on this point.
Go for it.
I've been from the East Coast to the West Coast. I've been all the way up to the Northeast, all the way to the Southwest. I've been to the Northwest, all the way to Key West, Florida, doing surveying. One thing that I've seen and I've noticed that basically the original 13 colonies, everything north of the 31st parallel, the original 13 colonies, what we call the Eastern Seaboard, not Florida, they have a tendency to wonder, what the heck am I talking about with and prorating this and prorating that, and and breaking the section. They can't fathom it because they go out there and they hold stone walls
Right.
because they've been there forever.
400 years. Yeah.
And out west, we're breaking the sections down every time we go out there.
Yeah. We talked
And
about
then
that
in
last time.
the southeast, we're kind of have a little bit of both. So
There you go. All right, Williams.
I like it. So I'm jumping over to page 39 here. I think just to drill in this final little point about the, well, right there, it says the federal government, the infallibility of original monuments set by the original surveyor. It says all corners marked in the surveys returned by the survey journal shall be established as a proper corner of sections or subdivisions of sections, which they were intended to designate. So, I mean, even the federal government recognizes this in their surveys. It's right there. We talk about it, we talk about it, we talk about it, we talk about it. The monuments are where they are. They represent the corner there. And so I think
and you know why they had to do that, because they were out there putting 600 1 mile squares on the ground, 80 chains by 80 chains, 640 acres, and the patentees, the instrument were going out there. I don't have 640 acres. I don't have 80. I have 79 chains. I want my full section. No, they had to put an end to it. No, there's a federal law that says no. Wherever we set the monument, that is the corner, and that is probably the only place in American jurisprudence where, when the pin was set, it became the corner, because the corner is a legal thing. It's a legal idea. A monument is a thing, and that's probably the only situation where, when the monument was set, it instantaneously became the corner.
Okay. Now the next portion is which really I enjoy when I can see Jeff live and in person, because now we get to the true Southern preacher portion. I've heard the same talk, right? If you've ever heard him at a conference here, and talking about the Bible, Jacob took the stone and set it upon the pillar, and he said his relatives gather stones, so they took and that's it. And if you've ever watched, Jeff blesses the stone and everything like that. And so it's we've got some wonderful examples here of why the stone, again, just drilling in this point. The monument is representative of the corner being that theoretical location, but the monument represents that as evidence to that. And so
I like it. Do you see my note number 9? Notice that his uncle Laban took credit for building the pillar. Jacob and his family built the pillar, and Laban says, "Look at the pillar that I built." And then it was so, Williams, for 4,000 years, until some surveyor came along with GPS and said, it's a foot and a half off.
It's a 4-foot round pillar of stone, but it's a foot and a half off because I
A foot and a half off. That's like, what is that? The Four Corners Monument? Some dude went out there a decade or so ago with his handheld GPS. It's off.
Yeah.
Do y'all remember that? Do y'all remember that?
That was big out here. Yeah, we had talked about that quite a bit, about why it's not, and all over the news and everything. Yeah. But people believe it because surveyors are apt to do that, right? Like, it's not a surprise that, oh yeah, state corner's off. Must have been another surveyor. No surprise to anybody.
There's a video also out there at Colorado has like 680 angle points in it or something like that, because of basically the way they surveyed it. And so now there's a video out there that says how many angle points are within the state because of corrections and that kind of stuff. So it's kind of funny. It's not because they use it as an example. Well, Colorado should be four corners, right? But they jokingly say there's like 658 in there or something, 680 or something.
I'm jumping over to page 41 now. The next kind of thing I had highlighted here, and please anyone jump in if you guys have any questions or comments about what we're talking about, but this prima facie here. So monuments enjoy high standing in the superiority of calls. This, we touched on it, I think it was 2 sessions ago, really quick, I think even last time, but the federal rules for evidence are rules for construction, right? Monuments being the top call. So prima facie, a fixed visible monument can never be rejected as false or mistaken in favor of mere course and distance as the starting point, when there's nothing else in the terms of the grant to control and override the fixed and visible call. So as we've gathered this evidence, this is the how we do what we do portion of the discussion, right? We've talked about gathering all this evidence. The calls and the deeds are one portion of the evidence. The monuments on the ground are another portion of evidence. The fence is another evidence. The testimony of the neighbors is another piece of evidence. And we have all this here. And how do we determine which evidence is good and which evidence is bad? And here's one great rule for determining what evidence is good. Well, a visible monument can never be rejected as false or mistaken in favor of mere course and distance, right? Here's a rule to test out if the evidence is good right there. It is seldom that surveys. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, one thing that I was thinking about when I read this is in Utah, at least, you've got boundary by agreement, right? And the way the courts interpret it here is that yes, you and your neighbor need to come to an agreement, but you've also got to take some action that represents that you have come to an agreement, represents the intent of that agreement. And when it talks about intent, I mean, you'll see some descriptions, and we've talked about this in other sessions, where it runs a course to a very specific rebar and cap, or to a very specific bounding call that represents a specific monument on the ground. And that those kinds of descriptions are very clear on what their intent is. And there have been cases that I've been in where the intent was not as clear. You had to use secondary or tertiary sources to figure it out, like an unrecorded subdivision plat, because the intent was clear if you look at the plat, and it's not clear if you don't. But it all comes down to the intent of the grantor. What do they actually think they owned, and what do they think they sold you?
Mm-hmm.
Well, let me interject something right here. I think it's applicable. It's not in the chapter. I think we have surveyors. Retracement surveying is an evidentiary exercise. It's not a math and measurement problem. I think we all know that by now, especially this group. Other groups, maybe not so much.
Preaching to the
But
choir.
there's a couple of, how do you know you got it right? Okay, so there's a couple of things that are play in our favor. The boundary establishment doctrines or location doctrines, you can call them either one, rest on presumptions. The doctrine of monuments. The reason that monuments in the ground at the time of the conveyance represent the true corners because there's a legal presumption that when the grantor sold to the grantee, they beat the bounds, they walked the bounds. Roblard probably even talks about that too. That's a legal presumption. Legal presumptions are facts, legal facts until proven wrong in court, basically. Now there are rebuttable presumptions. The monument is the actual corner. That's rebuttable. But going in, the presumption is the monument in the ground, especially people have built their improvements to it, and they go and point it out to you when you're surveying their property, or the next door neighbor says, "Here's the corner. It's right there. It's that monument." That's a legal presumption. It's rebuttable. But in order to it's a legal fact. A presumption is a legal fact. To overcome that legal fact, you have to have more and better evidence to the contrary. And all you need, we talked about this, Trent Williams talked about this last time around. What do you need to pass the test in court? You need more than 50%. All you need is a 51. And, you know, and Trent, I know, Williams, I know you got through school, you know, making D's the whole way through. You would be a great surveyor, okay? So, but there are unrebuttable presumptions. The sun rises in the east. Okay, you can't rebut that. So there's two types of presumptions. A legal presumption. This is the thing that's on your side, though. This is the thing that's in your toolkit. If I go with the presumption that I'm flipping a coin, either the monument or the mat, and I go with the monument, I'm going into court with the law on my side. Somebody else is going to have to prove that that monument isn't the corner. And then there are inferences. Inferences aren't facts. An inference is a legal, a mental process. Okay, we can draw inferences. Now there's a two-part test. It almost sounds like the same thing. An inference has to be reasonable, a reasonable inference, and it has to pass the common sense test. Okay, and surveyors. A lot of surveyors and a lot of survey activity and a lot of survey results. I see surveyors don't have either one. Some surveyors don't have either one of those. Common sense, or or reasonable, or they are reasonable. So we can draw inferences from what we see on maps and what we see in the field, and we can rely on presumptions. And you're winning. If you got to go to court, you're winning all the way. Somebody has got to overcome those presumptions and prove that your inferences were not reasonable and don't pass the common sense test. And here's an inference that doesn't pass the common sense test. So I'm just going to infer that somebody broke this section down again, because it's already been broken. Okay, here's the inference. I didn't have this planned out. A section's been broken down, and the section is in repose now for at least 20 years, if not 50 or 100. The reasonable inference is that that section's been broken down once, and those surveyors at the time maybe followed proper procedure, maybe they didn't. But there's breaking a section down, there's no federal law that says they have to follow any procedure, because they're not government employees. They're hired by the locals. So you can make the inference that, hey, it's been broken down once already. Why do I need to break it down again? That's a reasonable inference. And now I've got monuments out there that everybody likes. Those are presumptions. There's the reason why right there. You explain to me, TK, how it is reasonable or passes the common sense test to break down a section that's already been broken down. That doesn't even pass the horse sense test.
Because I'm using an on-site base with GPS and RTK, and the last guy used one that was a baseline that was 10 miles away, so I have better accuracy.
Well,
sorry.
we had a situation in my area that was both ends of the scale. I had surveyors that were county surveyors in the 20s and 30s, which was a long time ago for y'all, and they actually broke down sections exactly as the federal guidelines stated. And their accuracy was probably, or usually found by today's standards, to be about 1 part in 3,000. In other words, you would find a center section within a couple of feet of where it ought to be. On the other end of the scale, we had a huge amount of property in Arkansas that was owned by timber companies or by private individuals that had large tracts of land that was considered timberland. And these timberlands were often cut in small squares of 40 acres. So even though a timber company may have owned 4 adjacent total sections, they may have picked one 40 acre or 80 acres out of one section to be cut at one time or another. And so they had a reason they wanted to go out and mark off these sections into quarters and sixteenths. And they did so with a compass and pacing. And you can imagine how accurate that was. And they typically left some kind of a monument there. Often timberlands didn't have rocks available, so they left a pine knot at the corner that they did by this. Unfortunately, later on, maybe 50 years later, they started selling some of this, and we had some small private ownerships that were described off of these terrible located corners that were set by compass and pacing. And those are held today because that's what the grantors describe these smaller tracts off of. If you go in and you survey one of those tracts, you have to use that corner. But if you go to a different part of that section, to an area where the landowners have not been using the center of the section, let's say that you have a job to set a 16th corner that doesn't involve the landowners that have been using this erroneous or ill set center of the section, then you're under no obligation to have somebody, owners in the center of the section, control the rights of a person who has not had any part of that in another part of the section. So in those areas, we have an actual location that was defined by the government, and a physical monument that is conclusive against a number of owners that have used it or their predecessors in titles have used that to define their properties. So it can be complicated, but because one set of group of landowners decide to use a monument for their lands to describe their lands, doesn't mean that that monument should be used for somebody who is well away from that area and has not been a part of that operation. And so when we get down to who is the first guy that got there, was it a county surveyor that said it just exactly pretty close to the right? Or was it somebody that said something that was done by a compass and pacing? And if so, the only reason to use that erroneous set corner is because the landowners adopted it. They have used it. They have by themselves committed themselves and all of the people that followed them to those corners. And so it's not exactly the first guy that shows up out there, but it can be if the owners use that as a thing. Now, when it comes to following the footsteps of surveyors, I don't like to use that term a whole lot, because what it really is giving effect to what the grantor, his intent. The grantor's intent is what is primary, and where the grantor's intent is that you are to follow in the footsteps of the surveyor, that's what you better do. If the grantor indirectly has included in his conveyance something that can only make sense if you use the survey that was done about that time, then you are forced to follow in the footsteps. Otherwise, let's say that a grantor had a survey done, he didn't like the survey. And he wrote a meets and bounds survey that wasn't like the survey. Is that survey monument still good? No, no, they don't. If they don't conform to the intent of the grantor, they're just pins in the ground. So I don't know. I agree with most of what's said here, but with reservations. Okay?
And that's part of all the evidence gathering we do, right?
Yeah.
And to Jeff's point, right? The presumption of law, the fact there is that, as we just read, the monuments hold unless you can find enough evidence to show and argue that point, that 51% that we've been talking about. And to the first part of that, that's the challenge of surveying too, is local practice, right? What has happened there? Reliance on a perhaps erroneous monument. You really have to kind of know those areas you're working in. That's a whole other aspect to what we do is understanding the local nuances of it.
One of the things that gets me, and I think it causes a lot of this pincushion effect, is you take a subdivision, and maybe it was platted in 1940, let's say, and you go out there and you're going to find pins all over the place. You might find a few that look like the original pins, or something that is the type that was used at that time for lot corners. And you go all over and you get confused about stuff, and surveyors often send a party chief out there and tell them find the best corners that you can in the proximity of your lot and start off from there and lay out the geometry of your lot. Now, I think that's wrong, because what's really the way to put an end to this pincushion thing is to not look for two corners to base your survey off of, but to compare a pattern of monuments found and evidence found with the pattern of the original survey. I always start a survey of a subdivision with a presumption that it was actually laid out on the ground and that somebody did that was at least partially competent to measure out the lots in that subdivision. And probably there were.
I think that's a great segue, James, because the book actually talks about exactly that on page 42. And I wasn't planning on talking about it, but I think that's a great point of exactly what you're saying is the reasonable charge of that. It is, I think it's the last paragraph on 42. Another problem for the rule and its application is identifying the original surveyor. Was he or she the one who actually went to the field and ran the survey on the ground by cutting and blazing lines and setting the monuments or at the corners, or was he or she simply the one who drew the lines on the original plat or map, right? So there's this trust and reasonable charge to the crews that are out there and the procedures and the training that they have. It says here, at first glance, this may seem like a ridiculous question. After all, how can one leave footsteps on the ground by simply drawing a line on a map? Nevertheless, this is one of the most, if not the singular most divisive question raging through the surveying community today. How do you answer this question as a land surveyor places you in one of the two camps we discussed at the beginning of this text? You either believe that the surveyor has two roles, original and following surveyor, or you believe that the earlier survey work is subject to correction if the earlier survey didn't get it right. This brings out our hybrid surveyor, the first surveyor concept. We will consider this first surveyor in the next section. And so there is this balance there of trusting the surveyor before you'd have done it right, his crews to do it right. But to James's point, is going out and gathering all the evidence, looking at it as a whole, not just, even a simple lot survey in a subdivision that may be all correct. You look at that subdivision, the exterior boundaries whole, gather all the evidence, make sure you have it all there. I mean, that's one of my first procedures is, going and getting the monuments, all the monuments in the subdivision, and locating them so that I can tie my map to what's on the ground, locating evidence of fences and rivets in the curb and all that, and looking at it as a whole picture, I think is critical to that evidence gathering portion of our role.
Do you mind sharing your process for making that analysis of comparison with what you found with what is record for that subdivision?
Yeah, I've got a subdivision that I'm working on right now that doesn't have any centerline monuments, and it only has one tie to a section corner, and that section corner is not in. And so, from my standpoint, let's talk about breaking down the section, right? So I'm not breaking down the section. I am locating or have located all the known corners and witness corners in that section. So we're either taking some historic, shots that we have in there, going out and shooting something if it's been a while. But the first thing I did is I drafted the plat. It's an older 1940s, 1950s plat. Drafted that in CAD, gave that to my crew. I tied it to, again, already shot monuments or section corners in the area. And then I had my crew go out there, locate our lot, locate the fences, locate the home. In this case, there was a big 20-foot concrete retaining wall on the property, and that's kind of the line we're questioning is whose side of the property line is that wall on. And then I had them actually shoot, because there were no centerline monuments and it was only tied to one section corner. I actually had them go shoot a bunch of points, PCs of the curb and gutter, right? Let's establish, if I need to, the center line of this subdivision. And then we looked for property corners in the front corners, fence lines that would be indicative of how those lots would have laid out. And we looked for where we could property corners in rear of those lots. And this is the first task on my list tomorrow is actually I'll take all that evidence that our crews located with a GPS, and I'll lay that on top of my CAD recreation of the 1940s plat. And I just look and see, first step is, how does that all lay out together? Often what I see is there might be shifts mathematically from a tie to a corner or something like that. But when I look at that as a whole picture, not just my lot as a bubble in time, but the adjoining lots, often I find here that everything lays out pretty clean. Mathematically, it might be shifted because of errors in measurements, but everyone has what they're supposed to have, and it starts tying out fairly well. But I might have to go if there was a rivet that doesn't line up a fence. I've had to say, well, that rivet doesn't line up with the fence, but mathematically this fence and this fence and the next fence and the next fence all line up. They're all supposed to have 100 feet, and they all have 100 feet. Well, that rivet doesn't match it, but all the occupation starts matching it. So it becomes a pretty clear picture to me in this case of everything's where it's supposed to be, despite what a map might say. But sometimes I've leaned the other way for various reasons. But the argument has to be made. And to Jeff's point is that 51%, can I make those reasonable presumptions? Well, if the rivet matches the fence corner, the reasonable presumption then is that rivet represents the property line. It was a original corner that represented the line, right? Versus everything was shifted because everyone built kind of funny, but everyone has what they're supposed to have inside that original subdivision boundary. Does that make sense?
That sounds similar to what I would do, and I would say I want to ask you clarifying. What you do essentially is you take a record subdivision and you create a mathematical model in your computer. Yep. Then you take all of the evidence that you found on the ground, the physical evidence, and you put that in the computer as another mathematical model. And then you compare the one, you shift or try to overlay one upon the other. And then whenever you find that a majority of the elements of the physical align with the positions of the record subdivision, then you can see which corners are valid and which ones are erroneous. And you could tell you may find that original monuments closely match, but you might find an occasional original monument that doesn't match. And then your question becomes, did they set it in error or has it been moved? And
Well,
so,
I will say my discussion becomes, what evidence am I missing?
Yep.
yeah.
There's a lot of
Well-
pressure here to put my method out on the internet for everyone to remember. So what I will say to be politically correct here is, my next question is, what evidence did I miss?
That's
Yeah.
right. Yeah, exactly.
But almost every subdivision I ever worked in, there was significant amount of evidence that agreed with itself and would match the original subdivision, and there was always some that wouldn't. And most of the time, those monuments were either original monuments that match, but not necessarily. And sometimes the original monuments don't match because, let's face it, fellas, monuments get moved. They move in the night, or
That's
they
right.
move when a utility guy digs them up, sticks them back in the ground. You need to validate those monuments before you use them. And
That's
the way to do that is just like Trent is talking about. You've got to look for a pattern, a mathematical pattern. And we're lucky now because we've got computers that weren't around 60, 70 years ago. And we can do this thing with a mathematical model and compare the two, the record and what we found on the ground.
Yep.
So,
Hey, James, we got 20 minutes left here, so
Yeah,
let's
yeah.
and before so anyone interested in a good center quarter case, there was a good one in Oregon in 2006, Dykes versus Arnold, but it's all centered around a center quarter of a section, and you can go back and find a good court case on that one. All about a center quarter section. So
I appreciate the discussion because I think that's really important to talk about the house.
Yeah.
We're talking about theory in this, and the law, presumptions of law, but that how is really important. That's often what I think the mentor-mentee process is missing in surveying. So I appreciate that. But jumping back in
one
here,
other thing I'll try to be kind of brief on, and that is in mathematics, we think of a line has no breadth, it has no width. It's a concept. And the only thing that can be on a line is a point, and it has no breadth either. It has no size to it. When we take that type of concept to the field and we require that property lines have no width, we're going to get in trouble because property lines do have width. Just think about this. When you go down and with your car and you buy 10 gallons worth of gas, and the guy says it's $3 a gallon, you pay $30 exactly for the gas you got. But there's one thing you know for sure. You didn't get exactly 10 gallons of gas. Maybe you got 10 gallons and a few drops more. Maybe you got 10 gallons and a few drops less. But when you left there, the law considers you as having bought $10 worth of gas, and you got $10 worth of gas. And when it comes to lines out there on the ground for property lines, maybe we're trying to come up with a concept that a line is a mathematical line and it can't have any width, that every grain of sand has to be on one side of the line or the other. And I think that's wrong. I think we're better off if we explain to the courts and people, you have let your line fall into an area of minor disrepute, or surveyors can only define a line to a certain accuracy, just like the gas pump can only get so accurate with measuring the gas. So we've got weights and measures that tells us, that controls that. But what controls boundary lines out there? Our best thing is a surveyor to get as close as what is practically possible with the information that we have. And how
I
are we going
appreciate
to
that,
remember
James.
it?
We gotta move on here because I'm gonna
Yep.
run out of time.
Okay.
And
Yep.
my daughter's gonna turn to a pumpkin at the dance without me here. So,
Exactly.
but I do appreciate that gas analogy. I like
Yeah.
that because you are not necessarily getting a perfect 10 gallons, but you're getting close enough or reasonably close. I appreciate that. The one thing I'll
Almost
throw
like
in
a
here, and this
$3
leads
gallon of
into
gas
our
again.
next one, is making sure that we describe on the face of our survey our narrative, how we came up with a solution. I think that's critical to how we defend ourselves. But we talked about this a little bit at the beginning, and Jerry touched on this too, this idea of surveyor's intent. And so this plays perfectly into the discussion we've been having. It says surveyor intent, however, is pure survey mythology. I love that. There is no such thing under the law or equity. This concept has been created by surveyors for surveyors, right? Our actions must be reflective of the grantor grantee's actions, our client's instructions to us. And so I like this. Let's change our mindset of surveyor's intents. We talk about, well, what did the surveyor intend to put on the ground? Well, the surveyor intended to do what the client told him to split it in this way. And that's what the four corners of the deed are supposed to represent, because that's the tangible thing the client looks at, right? Either a plat or a record of survey or a deed that has descriptions on there. And so that's something a landowner can do and see and use. The surveyor intent. I like this change in our thinking of not surveyor intent, grantor's intent. And we've talked quite a bit about this today. So I just want to kind of punch on that portion of this real quick here. And then what else did I have highlighted here?
Have you guys seen the word used, surveyor intent, before? I have not. This was a new one for me reading this, and I had not seen surveyor intent before.
And Jeff
Well,
puts it at the
David,
bottom here.
I can speak to that. David, I've seen it in court cases, but when you read it in context, the surveyor was out there doing what the subdivider or the grantor wanted him to do. So I have seen it in cases, but in context, it's not really legitimate. Just like you'll see in cases, they'll call a retracement survey a resurvey. A retracement survey is not a resurvey. Look up what to redo something is. That's to do it over again. Basic retracement theory is not a resurvey. Look at the BLM manual definition of a resurvey. They got two kinds, independent and dependent resurveys. What are they doing? They're doing the survey all over again to jettison the previous original survey and now put a new original survey on the ground. So the courts use terms that just don't make any sense a lot of times. Resurvey is one of them. And you see it a lot in court cases. But I have seen surveyor intent in court cases, but that's the only place I've ever seen them. Because as far as deed interpretation goes, and Trent Williams was on this just a second ago, the number one thing you're after in trying to interpret a deed is the intent of the grantor. That's where intent comes into play.
Wonderful, I like it.
Yeah.
The rest of what I had here, I'm jumping almost to the end of the chapter here. We covered some court cases and some examples. And I think we've covered the kind of in our discussions today, but the last little bit here is at the bottom of middle of 56. We've talked about this first surveyor's concept, this idea that the original surveyor was wrong, so I'm the first surveyor to come and actually do it correctly. And Jeff's talked quite a bit about this in different places, and we've touched it here. So in the last 10 minutes or so that we have left, or just a little less than that, I'm going to let Jeff loose here to kind of let him talk about the court cases he has in here, or define his problem with the first surveyors, and maybe just, I'll let you just ramble for a little bit, Jeff, to wrap us up on the chapter.
You must be getting tired and ready to wrap things up, Trent Williams. Okay, the first surveyor concept, just, I danced around it in the book. It's really, I did a deep dive on the first surveyor concept, Rivers versus Lazio, several years ago in my newsletter after I did the Pincushion Effect. It's obvious where it came from. Walt Roblar got involved in that case somehow, and I'm assuming he got in the year of judge. Had some great description of the first survey of the original surveyor, and then second the following surveyor. But then they came to this thing about this first surveyor, and what happened in that case was it was a section that had been in Florida that had been originally surveyed back in the 1800s. And then just as federal law contemplated, local surveyors got hired to come in and further break that section down, and everybody was happy. This had to do with a 16th section, maybe a 16th section line that had been in place for, 20, 30 years, something like that. And then the BLM came along to do a dependent, supposedly a dependent resurvey of that area of the township, and they ended up running down that 16th line, which is very close. It was like a 16th. It was the line. It was a 40-acre line. Okay, the north boundary of the I think it was the north boundary of the south east quarter of the southwest quarter, something like that. It was a 40-acre tract.
Yep, you're good. I just pulled up the case.
Okay.
Yep.
And so that 40 acres got broken down by a private surveyor, just as the federal government contemplated, just as described in the 1973 manual, just as described in the 2009 manual. Surveyor came out there and ran the south boundary of the north 400 feet of that 40-acre tract, and everybody was happy until the BLM came along. They did a dependent resurvey. They had forestry land. I'm not sure the forestry land was right. It wasn't right on the north boundary of that quarter. They were just out there, breaking sections down all over again. And I can show you that. Maybe we get to it later on. But anyway, I looked at the 1983 resurvey of that section, supposedly a dependent resurvey. And what does a dependent resurvey mean? It means they're just going to survey the land that they own, not land that other patentees have already got possession of. At least that's the way it's supposed to work. And due to their breakdown of the section and realigning the section, the section lines became straight all of a sudden in 1983. I guarantee you, in the 1850s, in Florida, those section lines were never straight. They were doing them with compass and chain. There's no modern day with modern day tools. There's no way those lines were straight. Well, they straightened them all out, and then they broke that section down, and then their breakdown of the section, they were breaking down, all 16 lots in there, and their breakdown of that section came basically 30 feet down into the quarter section that had been there and surveyed for years. More and most likely, the section, an inference could be made that the section was broken down originally based on the original monuments that were out there at the time. And then, so then the lawsuit happens, and that's when they go to court. And there was a trial. I don't know much about the trial because the appellate, then it went up on appeal. The loser appealed, and it goes up to that appellate court judge, and that's where we saw the quote about the lines drawn on a map. This is what the judge said. I'm paraphrasing. That quarter section line, that quarter section line, that north line of that quarter that was the subject of the lawsuit, was drawn on a map. It was drawn on the GLO map. They did the sign of the cross for the quarters, and then did the sign of the cross on each of the other quarters. We had 16 lots that they came up with. They were all drawn on that map. And what the judge said in that case was the act of drawing them on the map was just as if they had surveyed it on the ground, and Moorhead, the private company surveyor who came out there and actually drew the 400, the south line of the 400 feet of that quarter, did not follow the original surveyor because he's 30 feet south of a based off of a 1983 resurvey of a 100-year-old section that's out there on the ground. And because he didn't get the same results as the BLM surveyors, he was only a first surveyor out there putting that line in, and therefore not the original surveyor, and therefore his survey was illegitimate. And then it ends up in evidence and procedures shortly after that. Matter of fact, I think I had, did I quote out about
you quote that, and you even talk about, and we've talked about that here, how he starts kind of retracting some of his discussion.
Now, if you read the 1973 manual, and you read the 2009 manual, especially the 2009 manual, this has been pretty much cleared up. The focus surveyors have had is the intent of this goes back to what we we're just discussing. The intent of the survey. The surveyor did not follow proper procedure. The surveyor didn't get close enough. The whole focus of the surveying community, especially when it comes to stationalized lands, is what did the surveyor do? Did he do it right? Did he do it wrong? Did he follow proper procedure? That's not the question. In the 1973 manual and the 2009 manual, the surveyor is totally irrelevant. What they talk about is, in those two manuals, is the entrymen, the patentees, and the claimants. Did they show good faith in it's called the good faith location doctrine. Did they show good faith in locating their properties out there in that section? How much more good faith could those people in that 40-acre tract have had other than hiring the local surveyor to come out there and show them where their property lines are? They were in good faith, and their bona fide rights were stepped on, trampled by the federal government. And there's a federal law against that. The Secretary of the Interior cannot cause a resurvey to be done that will infringe upon the bona fide rights of entrymen, patentees, and claimants. Now, they didn't come up with that law until 1902, but this is well past 1902. So I get a little exercise. This is how I get my workouts. Yeah, I get a little exercise over this crap, which I shouldn't, but I do. And you know why I do? Because I have learned at this point in my career as a boundary surveyor, it's not about surveyors. It's not about me. It's about the people. That's what the BLM manual has been saying for 30 years, more than 30 years, 50 years, probably since the 1939 manual. I think it was the 39 manual, was the very first one for the Bureau of Land Management. Before that, it was Surveyor Generals issuing instructions. It's about the people. And here's the rub. Here's the rub. We don't like people. That's why we became surveyors. I think we talked about this last week. And the BLM manual is all about the people. The surveyors are irrelevant. Matter of fact, what they say is what you're supposed to do in order to exercise your bona fide rights is you are to use good faith efforts in locating your property. And who's supposed to do that? Is the BLM surveyors coming back? No. You're supposed to hire the local surveyor. So this case is a disaster. But it is, and it is the genesis of the first surveyor concept. You never see it anywhere else. You never, only in evidence and procedures and in Rizzo versus Rivers versus Lazio. That's the only place you find it. But it has caught hold, especially out west where you guys are, because it's like, I don't have to honor this monument that's been Dykes versus Arnold. What did they do in that case, TK? What they did was in 1899, Derrick, the county surveyor, stubbed into center quarter. He ran from the east quarter to the west quarter, came back to the midpoint on true line, and put a 4x4 cedar post 3 feet into the ground. Who has that kind of information? Well, they apparently did at this county surveyor's office in Oregon there. They knew what Derrick did. They knew when he did it, and they knew what he set in the ground. And then the other surveyor came out there in 2002 with RTK GPS and broke the whole thing down over again and moved the center quarter 71 feet north and west of the post that had been there for 100 years. 1899.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay, I'm going to hit pause right here, Jeff. I'm going to hit pause right here because it is my time to go. You guys can continue the discussion, but thank you for another great week. I appreciate it. I'm turning it off, but don't let me stop the fun, guys.
Are you done with chapter 2? We're going to chapter 3.
Yeah, I think
we're
we're good
done
enough
with
on chapter 2 to jump to 3 now. So
Yeah. Jeff did a mic drop.
I like it. Thanks, guys. Have a great night.
Drop the mic. All right, guys.
Awesome.
Have a great evening.
Yeah, so much stuff, so much fun in these court cases. So it's they're loaded. That's why I enjoy this book so much too, because there's so much court case citing. So I love it.
Thanks a lot, TK. Appreciate
Awesome.
it.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Have a good
All
week,
right,
everybody.
Thanks.
Bye, guys.
2 weeks, right? Yeah.
Yes, sir. Yep. We'll be back at 4. So
Goodbye.
bye, guys.